Today we're going to talk about the aperture priority setting. On the Nikon camera, you turn the dial to the letter A to set it for aperture priority. Next we're going to discover what happens to the shutter speed when you're in aperture priority.
To switch your camera into aperture priority mode is usually a dial on the top of the DSLR. So for example, on the Canon camera, we can simply switch it here from the green square or wherever it might be into the AV mode. And AV stands for aperture evaluation. On the Nikon, it's simply the letter A for aperture priority. And on Sony, it's also an A. Again, A for aperture priority. But what that means is that you as a photographer are going to choose the aperture for the picture, and the camera is going to automatically choose the shutter speed to go along with it. So let's talk about what an aperture actually is and what happens to the shutter speed when you change the aperture.
When your camera is in aperture priority, inside the lens, you have what's called the aperture leaves. When you're opening it up, the aperture gets wide. When you're closing the aperture down, the aperture starts to get a little bit smaller. This limits or makes available the amount of light in your camera. Photography is just that, controlling the light in the camera. So say for instance you wanted to capture a fast-moving sports event. You would open your aperture to the widest aperture possible. And if you want to see blur action, as in if you were shooting a race car event, to see the blur of a car, you would close down the aperture to make available the possible light in your shutter speed. So in essence, you're controlling the aperture, but also controlling the shutter speed in the background.
So that means the shutter has to be open for a less or shorter amount of time. As we close the lens down, close down the aperture to a smaller hole, less light comes into the camera at once. So to make it a proper exposure, the shutter is going to have to be open for a longer time. So if you want to have fast pictures, you generally want to have the lens open at its biggest aperture setting. That's going to give you the fastest shutter speed. If you want to have a slower shutter speed, because for example, let's say you want to have motion blur in your photo, then you're going to need to close down the lens to a smaller aperture to restrict the amount of light coming in. So one of the other things that changes when you change your aperture is something called depth of field. That is how much is in focus. So with a very large aperture, you have a very shallow depth of field. Now shallow depth of field means that if I'm photographing from here pointing this way, only a narrow band of information is going to be in focus. So this is great if you're shooting a portrait, for example, and you want the stuff behind the person you're shooting to be blurry. If you have that large aperture, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. And that's going to give you that really nice, pleasing view for a portrait. However, if you're shooting something like a landscape and you want to have a whole bunch of stuff to be in focus at once, you want to go the other way. You want to stop the lens down. You have a smaller hole, which is going to give you a bigger depth of field. Now, how do you remember all this? Because we're talking about aperture being bigger and smaller and these numbers. And what do all these mean? Well, first of all, let's talk about the actual numbers. If you look at this lens again, if I take it down to the smallest setting at 1.8, that's the number 1.8 on the lens. If we take a look at that, you'll see that it's actually wide open. So the smallest number is giving me the biggest hole. Hold on a sec, how is that? Well, let's just verify this. I'm going to take this lens now and go the other direction, all the way down to f22. And now, let's take a look at it again. And as you can now see, we're looking at the smallest hole, or the smallest aperture that this can make. So how come the bigger number makes a smaller hole, and a smaller number makes a bigger hole? Well, it's actually a fraction. It's f over that number. So here's the easiest way to remember this. If you want a small depth of field, choose a small number. If you want a big depth of field, choose a big number. So shallow or small depth of field is a small number. Big broad depth of field is a big number. That's the easiest way to remember that. And if you can keep that in your head, that's all you have to know when it comes to shooting in aperture priority. So now, let's talk a bit about the different scenarios where you might use a particular aperture. You have to take in consideration what type of environment you'd be in or what type of thing you might be shooting. So let's start with the settings. A low number, meaning wide open, is something like f2 or f2.8 or 4 maybe, just depending on the lens that you have. As far as the when and why, generally you're doing that if you have low light. or if you just want to have really good shallow depth of field. And so that's the result of that. You get that nice shallow depth of field, which is great for portraits or anywhere you need high shutter speed. If we go to the other direction, the high number or the stop down, giving us something like f16, 22, or 32, generally we have so much light that we need to restrict it, or we want that really big depth of field for things like the scenic shots. So once again, depending on what aperture we choose will really depend on the scene that you're shooting. Portraits, generally you want to have that shallow depth of field. Scenic, you want to have a bigger depth of field. And of course, there's no right answer, and there's always somewhere in between. So this is something you just have to play with, and you get to know your lens and your camera for the type of environment that you're shooting.